What is happening, everyone? We got another UFC card to break down, and it's going to be a good one. We got Nurmagomedov taking on Corey Sandhagen in the main event this weekend. Should be a number one contenders fight. There's also a number of other good fights on the card, and we're going to break it all down here using the Stochastic Sims tool, and then also going over some of my picks for the individual fights here. As you're watching this, do me a favor, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And this week should go better for me than last week did, because it can't go worse. Last week was terrible. I got my ass kicked, even worse than Leon Edwards got his ass kicked by Bilal Muhammad. I got beaten in the betting streets, got beaten in DFS, which it's going to happen from time to time. Not going to win all the cards, and every once in a while, you get humbled, you get your ass kicked. And many people reached out to let me know on Twitter, either by DMs and telling me I suck, or just send me messages to let me know it went poorly. So I knew from that angle as well. It was not just that I lost money. I also had the messages letting me know how poorly it went, which I'm aware of. So I've been actually really looking forward to this week's card, because it's a good bounce back week, and I get to erase what happened last week if I make a bunch of money this week. So start to get into it here. We did do a giveaway last week, but nobody won. What the question was who would be the cheapest DraftKings fighter to win on the card? The answer was Bruna Brazil. She ended up beating Molly McCann at 7K. We had 50 people submit responses last week, and not a single person ended up getting the answer correct. So no winners from last week. One thing that was kind of interesting that came out of the fight is, Tom Aspinall winning and looking really good, calling out John Jones afterwards, is we've got betting odds up now for Tom Aspinall against John Jones. It actually opened. Aspinall is currently a minus 150 favorite over John Jones. I'm kind of curious. Let me know in the comments here. Two things. Number one, will John Jones agree to fight Tom Aspinall? And then if they fight, who do you think wins? And like I said, current betting market has Tom Aspinall minus 150 favorite. Come back on John Jones plus 130. It's just kind of curious to see where it is that you guys stand on that. But let's start breaking down this week's card, beginning with the main event. Corey Sandhagen taking on Umar Nurmagomedov. And this is going to be a very chalky fighter in Umar. If you look at our current projected ownership on our first run here, we have Nurmagomedov projected for right around 50% ownership, and then Corey Sandhagen projected for just under 30% ownership on the other side. I think this is a great fight to target, not just because it is a 5-round main event, but also because of the style clash here. If Umar Nurmagomedov is able to land takedowns, which I think that is the most likely scenario. Sandhagen only defends takedowns at a 64% clip. And then at times, we've also seen him struggle to get up after being taken down. Then I think Umar puts up a really big DraftKings score. However, if the length and the size of Corey Sandhagen gives him issues and he's not able to land takedowns, I think Sandhagen is going to have a massive advantage on the feet. And you could certainly see a scenario where Corey Sandhagen is able to knock out Umar on the feet. So considering the betting odds being as wide as they are, Umar right around a minus 300 favorite, which I do in general agree with. I think that it's maybe a little bit too wide, but I'm not looking to bet Corey Sandhagen or anything like that on the other side. There are some question marks to be answered about Umar Nurmagomedov. We've never seen him fight a 5-round fight. We also don't know exactly what it's going to look like when he's facing this level of competition, because so far the matchups that Umar has had in the UFC, they haven't been all that difficult. He beat Beksat Almakhan in his last fight, and Almakhan does look like a pretty decent prospect, but he took that fight on, what was it, like a few days' notice, and also was an overmatched opponent there in Almakhan. Before that, he fought a very aged version of Raoni Barcelos. And then before that, he beat Nate Maness, who the UFC just cut. He beat Brian Kelleher. He beat Sergey Morozov. So this is a big, big step up in competition. And the way I'm playing this for DraftKings purposes, and I'm picking Umar to win, is I'm going to be overweight to both sides, though. I've got Umar in right around 60% of my lineups. And on the other side, I've got Corey Sandhagen in just under 40% of lineups. So I'm overweight to both sides right now. I think that's the best way to play it. I do kind of have a gut feeling that there's a chance we'll see Corey Sandhagen knock out Umar Nurmagomedov, but I don't think that's the most likely scenario. It's really just more of a gut feeling. And Umar, I do think, is probably the best overall play on DraftKings. For cash games, I think you want to stack this card, but if you're building one lineup and want to know which side to play, I do have a little bit more exposure to Umar Nurmagomedov. In the co-main event, we have Shara Bullet Magomedov taking on Mikhail Olashechuk, and I'm not super high on Magomedov as a prospect. There's clearly a massive hole in his game. That is the takedown defense and the grappling, which we haven't really had to see get tested so far. There's only had 2 fights in the UFC. Bruno Silva was able to take down Magomedov 3 times, held a bunch of top control time in the final round as well. And then against Antonio Tricoli, we never really saw that fight get to the ground. Tricoli also took that fight on short notice. And another thing that ended up happening was we saw Tricoli was about to land one takedown in the second round, and then you don't know what would have ended up happening. But Magomedov has an egregious fence grab in that fight, and that it ends up keeping the fight on the feet. And then Tricoli was just kind of broken from there and got knocked out a little bit there afterward. It was, I think that fence grab was with like a couple minutes left in the second round, if I remember correctly. And then Tricoli got knocked out at the start of the third round. This is not a fear against Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. He is not going to be shooting takedowns. He only lands 0.73 overall. And then also Mikhail Oleksiejczuk, he's not come into fights with the best game plans all the time. He looks to be very aggressive, get into the pocket, stand and trade, which I think is going to do a couple of things. First off, it's going to force more activity out of Nurmagomedov, who in his fight against Antonio Tricoli was pretty content to just stay at distance on the feet and not do all that much because Tricoli didn't really force him to engage in any kind of striking exchanges. Oleksiejczuk will. And as a result, I think whoever wins this fight should score reasonably well on DraftKings. And I think we could say with a pretty high degree of confidence that Magomedov should be the favorite to win this fight. He's going to have a big size advantage over Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. I know he's only 2 inches taller, but he's also just the bigger physical athlete amongst the two of them. And I also do think that Magomedov, his ability to land kicks is something that could cause issues to Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. If you guys remember his fight against Michel Pereira, Pereira was able to land a couple of body kicks that really badly hurt Oleksiejczuk. Then Pereira took his back, ended up choking him out. But it was really the body kicks that set up that finish. Wouldn't be surprised to see Oleksiejczuk do the same sort of thing here. Magomedov do the same sort of thing to Oleksiejczuk. I'll take a couple of shots on Oleksiejczuk in large field tournaments just because if he does win, his path to victory is going to be an early knockout. But I think the most likely outcome here is that Nurmagomedov ends up winning by KO, probably in the first round. He's also going to be very popular. We have him projected for 37% ownership. So in my first run of lineups, I did come in a little bit underweight to the field on Magomedov, not because I dislike him in this spot or anything. He's just very popular, and there's a lot of payoff options I like. So there's some other fighters I got to more of him, but still, he's somebody who I'm going to have a good chunk of on the high end, just perhaps not quite as much in the field at nearly 40% ownership. This is a fight Chito Vera against Deiveson Figueiredo that I like more for a real-life perspective than I do for fantasy purposes, because neither of these guys are the best DraftKings scorers because the output is fairly low. And something else to take note of, too, is that both Deiveson Figueiredo and Chito Vera tend to be slow starters, which is an issue in a 3-round fight. So if you look at Deiveson Figueiredo, for example, his last fight against Cody Garbrandt, Figueiredo wins by second-round submission, but the first round, I thought Cody Garbrandt won, and, nothing happened. Garbrandt lands 14 significant strikes. Figueiredo lands 9. And that's kind of common for what we see out of the early stages of a lot of Figueiredo fights. It's also pretty common what we see in the first round from Chito Vera in a lot of his fights. So I think there's going to be very minimal scoring in the first round of the fight. And then a lot of times when Figueiredo does score well from DraftKings purposes, it's relying on him getting a finish in the second or third round. And Chito Vera is nearly impossible to finish unless he's just really a different fighter coming out of that brutal beatdown he had against Sean O'Malley. But O'Malley hit him with everything. There was a brutal knee that O'Malley had landed on Chito Vera's face at one point. It sounded like a baseball bat hitting him over the head, and Chito didn't even flinch. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to put away Chito Vera. I think it's going to be a very close competitive fight. I lean slightly towards Vera. If I had to play a side in DraftKings, it would be Chito just for the cheaper price point. But overall, this isn't a fight that I'm going to have all that much exposure to. Michael Chiesa taking on Tony Ferguson. And why is Tony Ferguson still fighting at this point? It is been since June 8th of 2019, his win over Cowboy Cerrone, since we last saw Tony Ferguson get his hand raised in the octagon. After that, knocked out, well, not knocked out, is a TKO standing on the feet against Justin Gaethje, where Ferguson just took a brutal amount of damage. Then he gets a decision loss against Charles Oliveira. Looked like he screwed up his arm pretty bad in that fight. He got a decision loss against Beneil Dariush. Not real damage taken in that fight, so at least that's a positive for Tony Ferguson. One of the most devastating knockouts you'll ever see against Michael Chandler. Then he gets submitted against Nate Diaz. Against Bobby Green, he gets submitted. And then the fight against Paddy Pimblett. Hey, credit to Tony Ferguson. He actually survived the fight and nearly finished Paddy Pimblett in the third round, but that really said more about Paddy Pimblett's cardio than Tony Ferguson himself, because by the time we got to the final round, Paddy Pimblett was just completely gassed and then nothing left in the tank. So it did look like Tony Ferguson had a chance to finish Paddy Pimblett in the third round of that fight, but Paddy was able to land a takedown. They just held top position, was able to grind out the clock by doing that. In this matchup against Michael Chiesa, Tony Ferguson's career takedown defense isn't great at 67%. It's clearly even worse at this point in his career now that he's an aged veteran who's taken just a massive amount of damage. So I think the fight is pretty simple. I love Tony Ferguson. He's one of my favorite fighters of all time, but that was the Tony Ferguson of many, many years ago. We're talking about Tony Ferguson from 6-7 years ago. The current version of Tony Ferguson can't defend takedowns. He's very slow. Unless Michael Chiesa just happens to stick his neck right out into a choke going for a takedown, I think Michael Chiesa just takes Tony Ferguson down whenever he wants. Probably does it in the very early stages of the first round. And then he's likely going to either grind out a bunch of top position and get a submission, maybe land some ground and pound against Tony Ferguson. But I think Michael Chiesa wins, and I think it scores pretty well for DraftKings purposes as well. The only real question is whether we want to pay up to $9,500 for Michael Chiesa. And so far for me, the answer is yes. I have him in about half of my lineups. As long as his ownership doesn't move all that much, we currently only have Chiesa projected for 25% ownership because of the price point and the amount of other high-end pay-up options that we have on the slate. So there are definitely other options. You don't have to play Michael Chiesa, but I have him about half of my lineups. The field is more going towards guys like Umar Nurmagomedov or going to Shara Magomedov. I think Chiesa is a pretty good pivot off of some of the other high-end targets. The next fight that we have to look at is Mackenzie Dern against Lupe Godinez. And this is another fight that I'm not really going to be playing much for DraftKings purposes. I favor Lupe Godinez to win, but the scoring upside is clearly on the Mackenzie Dern side, because if we do see Lupe come into this fight with a smart game plan, she is not going to look to engage in any of the wrestling or grappling against Mackenzie Dern, because on the feet, Lupe has an advantage. On the ground, Mackenzie Dern has a massive advantage. So what I think we're going to see Lupe do is keep distance, try to keep it on the feet, in and out, boxing, maybe some low leg kicks. And I think that's the path for Lupe to win a pretty non-competitive decision where she just looks like the better fighter on the feet. However, if she comes in with a poor game plan, decides to wrestle, or maybe Mackenzie Dern is able to land a takedown, then I think Dern is live for a submission if this fight ever hits the ground. But if Lupe plays it smart and avoids that scenario, which she should be able to because she's the better wrestler of the two, then fight plays out on the feet, and I think we see Lupe win a pretty low-scoring decision. So I have no interest in Lupe for DFS purposes. If you think that Mackenzie Dern is potentially live for a submission, she's worth a couple shares of, but still, I think the most likely scenario is a ho-hum decision win for Lupe Godinez that I don't really want all that much exposure to for DraftKings. This is a fight that we do want a lot of exposure to. Elvis Brenner taking on Joel Alvarez, and this is a fight that is priced right in the mid-range. We have Joel Alvarez projected for 33% ownership at an $8,300 price tag. And then Elvis Brenner projected for 24% ownership at a $7,900 price tag. And I don't think either of these fighters are popular enough. This fight is nearly minus 250 to finish inside the distance. And the kind of pace that Elvis Brenner fights at, almost all of his fights are going to score reasonably well for DraftKings purposes. He's constantly moving forward. He's shooting takedowns. He's also striking at a pretty high clip. And the only time that we've really seen Elvis Brenner in fight that didn't score all that well, it was in his UFC debut against Zubair Tukhugov, but he was taking that fight up a weight class. He also took that fight on, it was like 5 days notice or something like that. Outside of that, he had a great fight against Guram Kutateladze. That one ended up being a war. The fight against Kenan Krzyzewski, that was a fight that ended up being really fun and then finished in the first round. And the fight against Mitsabak Oralbai, that was a fight where Oralbai was a massive favorite. I think that he's somebody who's a real contender in the lightweight division. And what ended up happening there was Oralbai looked really dominant in the early stages, but Elvis Brenner kept applying pressure, and nearly came back to end up winning in the third round of that fight. And this is where I think the fight gets really interesting. Elvis Brenner shoots a good amount of takedowns. He lands 1.59 per 15 minutes. Joel Alvarez doesn't defend takedowns at all. To the point where he doesn't even really, not that he can't defend takedowns, he doesn't even try because he is such a good submission game off his back. He is happy to be taken down and play jiu-jitsu off his back, which sets up a couple of things. Number one, if he gets a submission, well, then he gets a finish at a mid-range price point. That's favorable. But if he doesn't, he's going to allow his opponents to get a lot of takedowns and hold a lot of top position. So on paper, Joel Alvarez only has an 11% takedown defense. If I am not mistaken, I remember this correctly, he defended one takedown successfully against Mark Casey. That was the first time in the entire UFC career of Joel Alvarez that he defended a takedown. So very poor takedown defense for Alvarez. If he's not able to get a submission on Elvis Brenner, you could see a scenario where Brenner is maybe able to land 5-6 takedowns in this fight, do some damage with top control time. So in a win, I think Brenner scores exceptionally well at $7,900. But then also on the feet, Joel Alvarez, I think, has a little bit more power. I think that he is also a little bit more live for the finish if the fight was to hit the mat. Joel Alvarez, he's a killer. He is somebody who is able to finish fights with his grappling, on the feet with his power. So I think this is going to be a really fun fight. It should be a really good one to target. I currently have a little bit more exposure to Joel Alvarez, but I'm overweight to both sides. And I think that Elvis Brenner really getting slept on by the field if he really does end up coming in at 24% ownership. And we always do run updates on our projections and ownership on Saturdays. We get closer to lock and things could change, but it does look like Elvis Brenner is one of the better contrarian plays on the card. And if you guys do want to sign up for all of our data and our Sims package, you could build your lineups on our site and simulate them. There's links down below in the YouTube description box. A really helpful way also to make sure you aren't playing lineups that are projected to be really heavily duped, because that is something that plays a factor in our Sims, and we weed out some of those heavily duped lineups. Let's see what we have next here. We've got Azamat Murzakanov taking on Alonzo Menafield. And Murzakanov is projected to be pretty popular on this slate. We have him pulling 32% ownership. And the problem I have with Murzakanov is that, number one, he's expensive, and there's a lot of other spend-up options that we're going to like on this slate. But also, he doesn't really wrestle. He doesn't strike at a crazy high clip. So if he does not get an early knockout, he's probably not going to score well enough to be in a winning lineup on this slate. And if you look at some of the other fights that Murzakanov has been in, on the Contender Series, sure, he fought a can and he ends up getting a first-round finish. But then his fight against Tefan Chukwe, we saw him get a third-round finish where he only landed 28 significant strikes. Against Devin Clark, he gets a third-round finish where he only lands 79 significant strikes. And then his last fight, it was a decision win over Justin Jacoby where he only lands 67 significant strikes. So if Alonzo Menafield doesn't get knocked out early by Murzakanov, I think that Murzakanov is probably drawing thin to land in the optimal lineup for this fight. And then on the Menafield side, he is coming off one of the worst decisions that I've ever seen in a UFC fight. So Menafield is fighting against Carlos Ulberg in that fight. The round starts, the first round, and Menafield in a straight line runs pretty much as fast as he can right into a right hand of Carlos Ulberg, ends up getting knocked out in 12 seconds. I understand what it was that Menafield was looking to do. He was looking to get a takedown really early against Carlos Ulberg. He just did it so incredibly recklessly that he got himself instantly knocked out in that fight. And that's always going to be a concern, is the fight IQ with Alonzo Menafield. I do wonder if maybe he overcompensates and just is way too conservative on the feet in this fight. But what I really do think is the most likely scenario here is either somebody gets knocked out in like the second or third round, or it's just a kind of low striking, boring decision. So I'm going to be underweight to this fight, especially on the Murzakanov side, where he's going to be super, super popular. And there are so many high end fighters with upside. So I'm hoping that Murzakanov wins, but doesn't really do enough to be in the optimal lineup. I'll have some exposure to him, but I'm right now about half the field, a little bit more than half the field. I have 22% exposure to him when he's projected for the 32% ownership, and not taking too many shots on Alonzo Menafield. I have him in 16% of lineups right now. Next fight on the card, we have Muhammad Yahya taking on Kue Fernandez. And I don't think Fernandez is a great prospect or anything, but I know that Yahya is a very not good prospect who also is not going to be able to defend takedowns. He's only defending takedowns at a 42% clip, and it's not based on very big of a sample size, but he was taken down 4 times by Trevor Peek. Nobody should be getting taken down 4 times by Trevor Peek. So I'm assuming Fernandez saw that fight and goes, hey, if I shoot takedowns in this fight, I'm going to land them. I'm going to land them at will, and I'm going to have a pretty risk-free path to victory, which I think is how this fight plays out. I think we are going to see Fernandez potentially land a bunch of takedowns in this fight. He didn't look all that great in his UFC debut, but it was a pretty difficult matchup against Mark Casey. He was at least able to land 1 takedown of his own. It was a pretty competitive decision, and that says something, right? I mean, Mark Casey is somebody who's been in the UFC for a while. He's had some good wins in the organization, and this is a really big step down in competition for Fernandez against Muhammad Yahya. So Fernandez is a massive favorite. He is the second biggest favorite on the card, only behind Michael Chiesa. And he's also expected to be pretty contrarian. We've got Fernandez only projected for 17% ownership. And when I'm considering that, I think the path to victory for him, or at least I should say the easiest path to victory, because I think he's a better striker than Yahya as well. So if he goes down that path, I think he could win it in a striking based either decision, or it could end up finishing Yahya on the feet. But the easy path here, just look to wrestle, dude. And if he does that, I think he scores really well on DraftKings. $9,300 only projected for 17% ownership. If you really want to get contrarian with your spend up option, I think there's a really strong case to be made for Fernandez. He is my spend up to be contrarian favorite option on this slate. So him and Chiesa, as well as Umar Nurmagomedov, those are the three pay up options I have the most of. Umar, obviously popular. The other two, less so at the moment. Shamil Gaziev, I think I clicked on the wrong fight. Yeah. Shamil Gaziev taking on Dontel Mays. And Gaziev is somebody who is like pretty hyped coming into the UFC after he had a submission win on the Contender Series. Then he had a really good looking win over Martin Budai. So he ends up getting himself a main event against Jairzinho Rozenstruik and just looked terrible. What we ended up finding from that fight is that Gaziev has, I don't know, like a round and a half, 2 rounds of cardio, something like that, which ended up playing out in this fight where he looked okay in the early going against Rozenstruik. But once he started to fail on his takedown attempts, he just had nothing left. Honestly, Rozenstruik should have been able to finish him even earlier than he did because there was terrible body language for Gaziev. He was kind of like bending over, looking to catch his breath. So he ends up getting finished, actually quits in between the 4th and 5th round there. So that just makes it really difficult to trust him. And in a card where there are so many good pay-up options, you'd have to figure that Gaziev coming off of that fight worked a little bit on his cardio and be better prepared to fight 3 rounds. It's also notable that was a 5-round fight, and you will at most go 3 rounds against Dontel Mays. Also a really big step down in competition against Mays. I'm going to pick Gaziev to win. I definitely am going to be sketched out if this fight reaches the later stages of the 2nd or the 3rd round. But Dontel Mays is not particularly good. He's lost to a lot of lower level opponents in the UFC. He's a fringe UFC heavyweight, and the UFC just has a lot of low-level heavyweight fights that fill out cards. So I think Gaziev is the better prospect of the two for sure. He's got more upside between the two of them for DraftKings scoring purposes. Just because of the price point on Gaziev, I'm struggling to get to him a little bit. We have him projected for 26% exposure. I actually do have him right now as well in 26% of my lineups, but I'll probably lower that as I get closer to lock to instead get a little bit higher on guys like Nurmagomedov or Fernandez or Chiesa. So that's the way that I'm going to be looking to play this, is picking Gaziev to win. I'll have some exposure to him in DFS, but I'm ultimately going to be underweight to the field and not really going to be getting much exposure to Dontel Mays. Guram Kutateladze is taking on a UFC debuting fighter in Jordan Vucinic here. And Vucinic just fought a couple of weeks ago outside of the UFC. He is also moving up a weight class, considering that he took this fight on very short notice. And then it's a very big step up in competition for him as well against Kutateladze, where Kutateladze, he's had some weird results in the UFC, but I do think he's very, very talented. So he had the split decision win over Mateusz Gamrot, which has aged really, really well for Kutateladze. It's also one that was kind of controversial. You could definitely make a case that Gamrot won. Then he had the fight against Jamir Ismagulov, also very close fight, ends up being a split decision. Ismagulov, another very difficult fight. And then we saw him fight against Elvis Brenner, who's also fighting on this card. And I think Elvis Brenner is a pretty decent fighter as well. And Kutateladze looked great for the first 2.5 rounds of the fight. And then all of a sudden just gets finished in the 3rd round by Elvis Brenner. And it was on a shot that actually landed on the neck that knocked him out. It wasn't even to the chin or anything like that, but gets hit in the neck, crumbles, and then Elvis Brenner's able to finish him. So couple things here. I think this is the most difficult matchup that Vucinic has had in his entire career. And I think this is the easiest matchup that Kutateladze has had in the UFC to this point. Vucinic is a very good finisher. He's capable of finishing fights on the feet. He's also capable of getting opportunistic finishes in the grappling as well. So you can see a scenario where Kutateladze looks to shoot a takedown and maybe Vucinic is able to grab his neck and gets a submission. That was how Vucinic ended up winning his last fight, which only lasted something like 30 seconds off the top of my head. It ended very quickly in the 1st round when his opponent went and shot a takedown. So outside of that kind of path, though, I do think Kutateladze should be the overall better fighter. And I do think also has potential to score pretty well for DraftKings purposes. And he's not all that expensive. We've got Kutateladze, the $8,800. So if you're building a lineup where maybe you don't have the salary to spend up for Fernandez or Chiesa, or you don't have the couple $100 to get up to Nurmagomedov. Kudus is only projected for 20% ownership, and there is a chance that he's going to be fighting an overmatched opponent that is seeing a big step up in competition while also fighting up a weight class. So I do like getting to some of Kudus as a contrarian option. With him only being projected for 20% ownership, it's pretty easy to get overweight to the field on him. Next fight that we have is Victoria Dudikova against Sam Hughes. And this is not a fight that I have all the much interest in. I'm very confident this fight ends up going to the judges' scorecards. I do favor the Dudikova side, but I don't think it's going to score all that well for DraftKings purposes. Neither of these fighters really fight at super high paces. Dudikova lands 3.14 significant strikes per minute. Hughes lands 4.03. Then on the Dudikova side, she is the more likely to be landing takedowns of the two. She lands 2.45 takedowns. And considering we have seen Hughes at times struggle to defend takedowns, you could see a scenario where we do see Dudikova land some takedowns, hold top control position. But ultimately, this is a fight. I think it goes to the judges' scorecards. There's a lot of fights that should finish inside the distance. If I have to play one side of the fight, it would be the Hughes side just because she is cheaper and there are a lot of big favorites on the card. It is kind of hard to find salary savings, which is another reason why in some of these competitive fights like Joel Alvarez against Elvis Brenner, I get myself pretty well overweight to the field on Brenner just because it is so hard to find cheap fighters to save salary with this weekend. So Sam Hughes, if I had to play a side of for DraftKings, but this isn't a fight that I have too much interest in targeting. Jai Herbert against Rolando Bedoya. And I've placed one bet so far on the card. I bet Bedoya plus 120. I've gotten a little bit of line movement in my favor. It's close to a pick'em now. I think Bedoya is right around plus 105 at the time that I'm recording. Best available line plus 107 that I'm seeing right here. But here's why I like Bedoya. He should have a really big output advantage over Jai Herbert. And then something else as well. Bedoya has been fighting at 170 pounds, and he just looked like he didn't belong at that weight class. He was a little bit too small. He was very flabby looking as well. He was carrying extra body weight, and he looked to be in excellent shape at weigh-ins to fight at 155 pounds. So I don't think the weight cut looked like it was too much of an issue for Rolando Bedoya. And considering the low output of Jai Herbert landing 2.69 significant strikes per minute, even though we have seen Bedoya struggle at times in the UFC, it's been one, his cardio failing him at the later stages of fights at times. And then two, also just fighting better opponents that are also physically stronger than him, considering he's fighting up a weight class. But I mean, if you look at overall for his career, he's landing 3 significant strikes for every one that Jai Herbert is landing. So then you have to say, like, okay, if Bedoya is going to be the more active striker of the two on the feet, Jai Herbert either has to land takedowns, which he isn't going to do. Jai Herbert never shoots takedowns, or Jai Herbert has to knock out Rolando Bedoya. And so far, we've seen Bedoya take really big shots, particularly his UFC debut against Chaos Williams, and it didn't really seem to affect him all that much. So I think this is actually a pretty good matchup for Rolando Bedoya to win, most likely by decision, but then also be one of those cheap fighters that we could roster below 8K that is going to help us unlock some of the salary to pay up for more fighters. So I'm picking Bedoya to win. I'm betting him. And then he's also somebody who I'm getting exposure to as a punt option. Currently have him in 35% of my lineups. One other punt option that I like is in the first fight of the entire card. This is a really, really low-level fight. Cedric Dumas against Denis Tuolulin. Since coming into the UFC, we have seen Cedric Dumas get arrested more often than he's won fights. He has had numerous legal issues outside the octagon, anywhere from domestic violence to fighting in bars to DUIs. So Dumas has had all kinds of issues outside of the octagon, which kind of makes me wonder why it is he's even in the UFC, because I don't think he's a great prospect. His fights are terrible. They're all really boring. And then on top of it, you've got all of the other outside the octagon issues. So when it comes to the fight against Denis Tuolulin, Tuolulin's actually a pretty good striker. The problem with him is that he has questionable takedown defense. And then once he gets taken down, he has no ground game. So he doesn't have the ability to get up. And he also pretty frequently gets finished. I don't know how much of an issue that is going to be against Cedric Dumas, though, who only lands 0.71 takedowns per 15 minutes. And if this fight takes place on the feet, I do think Tuolulin's the better striker of the two. And considering how wide the pricing gap is here, where Tuolulin is priced at $7,300, it's hard for me to want to pay up for Cedric Dumas Same reason I've talked about some other fighters. There are a lot of fighters on high and that have a lot of upside, and that's just not the case with Cedric Dumas. He only lands 1.76 significant strikes per minute and doesn't land takedowns. So some of the ways that Dumas has won, here have been his winning fights. Abu Azaitar, frankly, I thought he lost the fight. So he ends up winning a fight that I didn't think he should have won. But also, Azaitar just didn't do anything. The fight was terrible. Then the fight against Cody Brundage, one of the worst fights of the last couple of years, where what ended up happening at the start of all the rounds in this fight is, for whatever reason, Cody Brundage started every single round by shooting for a takedown and then pulling guard. So Dumas was able to just lay on top of him for entire rounds and do nothing. And that was how he ended up winning. And then we saw Dumas's other two fights. He gets KO'd against Nursultan Ruziboev, and then he gets submitted by Josh Fremd. So I've been very underwhelmed by Cedric Dumas. I don't think Dennis Tululin's any good either, but there's just no scenario anymore, considering what we've seen out of Dumas, that somebody should be like $7,100 or a really cheap price point against him. So I don't have a ton of confidence in Dennis Tululin, but we've got him projected to be a contrarian option. He's $7,300. There's a lot of pay up options to like this week. And Dennis Tululin is somebody who, if we punt with, he's going to allow us to save some salary, pay up for the studs. And then there is some upside here in Dennis Tululin potentially knocking out Dumas on the feet, just as what happened to Dumas in his last fight. So that's going to do it for us today. If you guys haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. One other thing as well, I know I've been doing a bunch of giveaways, and a couple reasons why there isn't one this week. Number one, nobody won the giveaway from last week. But then the other one too, we're changing up a lot of the packages over on OddsShop. We're shuffling stuff around. So I don't have anything to give away for free on the OddsShopper end, but we are going to be doing, anybody who signs up for OddsShopper now gets grandfathered into our current packages, which includes everything. We're going to have our OddsShopper tools, and our Discord packages are going to be segregated going forward. So if you guys do want to sign up for OddsShopper, if you sign up with the link below in the promo code grandfather, you get yourself 50% off, and then you lock yourself into the current existing pricing and the structure that we have. So if that's of interest to you, sign up using the link that we have below. Other than that, guys, hope you enjoy the card. Good luck, and I guarantee it's going to be better for me this week. I got my ass kicked last week. Not going to hide from it. A lot of people on Twitter told me I should have deleted the video. For what? People know that it sucked for me. Got my ass kicked. Not going to hide from it. We'll be better this week. Good luck, and see you guys back here next week.